October 9th, 1942. Somewhere over occupied France at 25,000 feet, a 22-year-old waste gunner grips his .50 caliber Browning, watching through the frozen gun port as German fighters tear into the bomber formation ahead. 3 Focke-Wulf 190s slice through the scattered B-17s like sharks through a school of fish. He sees one fortress, call sign Lucky Strike, flying maybe 400 yards off his wing. Cannon fire rips through its fuselage. Within seconds, the entire crew is gone. The bomber corkscrews downward, trailing black smoke, and the gunner realizes something that makes his blood run cold. The formation is too spread out. His guns can't reach that far. Lucky Strike died alone in a sky full of friends. This wasn't rare. This was Tuesday. Between August of 1942 and early 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers at a catastrophic rate. On some missions, 1 out of every 4 flying fortresses that left England never made it back. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were brutal. If you flew the required 25 mission tour of duty, your chance of survival was roughly 25%. 3 out of 4 crews would be shot down, captured, or killed. These weren't numbers in some Pentagon briefing room. These were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, most of them barely 20 years old, who'd been flying bombers for maybe 6 months. The mission to Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, would hammer this reality home with merciless clarity. The 8th Air Force dispatched 230 B-17s to destroy ball-bearing factories deep inside Germany. 60 bombers never came home, 600 men gone in a single afternoon. At that rate, the Americans would run out of trained crews before they ran out of Germans to bomb. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The B-17 was genuinely tough. Boeing had built a 4-engine monster that could absorb punishment that would disintegrate other bombers. Engines could be shot out, tail sections shredded by flak, and these aircraft would still limp home. Crews told stories about fortresses landing with holes you could crawl through. The nickname Flying Fortress wasn't marketing hype. Each B-17 carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns, more defensive firepower than any bomber in the world. But here's what the planners in Washington hadn't fully grasped. 13 guns on one bomber don't mean much when that bomber is isolated. A lone B-17 might have guns pointing in every direction, but a Messerschmitt 109 attacking from 7 o'clock high, that specific angle above and behind, could pour 20mm cannon shells into the bomber for 3 or 4 seconds before any gunner could draw a bead on him. By the time the tail gunner swung his weapons around, the fighter was already gone, and the bomber was trailing fuel and fire. The early American bombing strategy had relied on a theory: if you put enough guns on a bomber and built it strong enough, it could defend itself in loose formations. Small groups of B-17s, sometimes just 6 or 8 aircraft, would head toward Germany in what they called company front formations. Bombers spread out horizontally with maybe 150 to 200 yards between aircraft. The idea was that spreading out made it harder for German flak batteries to score direct hits. The Luftwaffe loved it. German fighter pilots quickly learned that these loose formations were a buffet. They'd identify the straggler. There was always a straggler, some bomber with an engine running rough or a pilot who couldn't hold position, and they'd hit it with everything. 4 or 5 fighters would coordinate attacks from different angles simultaneously. The bomber's gunners would be spinning, trying to track multiple threats, and in that chaos, somebody would get through. Once one bomber went down, the formation got even looser, even more vulnerable. The formations were failing because American bomber doctrine in 1942 was built on flawed assumptions about how air combat actually worked. The Army Air Forces had spent years theorizing about strategic bombing, running exercises over the deserts of California and the plains of Texas. But those peacetime drills bore almost no resemblance to combat over the Ruhr Valley. Back home, enemy fighters were other American pilots following engagement rules and breaking off attacks at safe distances. Nobody was actually trying to kill anyone. Over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were fighting for their homeland, and they'd perfected the art of bomber destruction. The loose formations created massive gaps in defensive coverage. When B-17s flew 150 to 200 yards apart, the effective range of their 50 caliber Browning machine guns became the critical problem. These weapons could theoretically reach out to 1,000 yards, but combat effectiveness dropped dramatically beyond 400. Gunners needed to see their tracers hitting the target to adjust fire, and at extended ranges that became nearly impossible. A Messerschmitt 109 attacking at 350 miles per hour gave gunners maybe 5 to 7 seconds of firing opportunity. If the nearest friendly bomber was 200 yards away, its guns couldn't provide supporting fire during those critical seconds. Each aircraft was essentially defending itself alone. German fighter tactics exploited these gaps with surgical precision. Luftwaffe squadrons would position themselves ahead of the bomber stream, often climbing to 32,000 feet to gain altitude advantage. Then they'd roll over and dive through the formation, building speed to over 400 miles per hour. At those velocities, return fire from bomber gunners was largely ineffective. The fighters were simply moving too fast to track accurately. The Germans would fire a concentrated burst from their 20mm cannons, which had much longer effective ranges than American machine guns, then zoom back up to altitude before the bomber crews could respond effectively. One attacking fighter could make 3 or 4 passes in the time it took the bomber formation to cover 30 miles. Flak presented a different but equally deadly problem. German anti-aircraft batteries around strategic targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg had become extraordinarily sophisticated. By 1943, the 88mm guns could reach bombers at 26,000 feet, and German crews used radar-directed fire control systems to calculate trajectories. When American formations spread out horizontally, they gave flak batteries a wider target area. Instead of concentrating anti-aircraft fire on a dense formation where most shells might miss, the Germans could distribute their fire across a broader front, increasing the probability that each shell would find a bomber. The Americans had inadvertently made the gunners' jobs easier. Crew fatigue compounded these tactical failures. Flying in loose formations required constant vigilance and manual corrections. Pilots had to maintain visual contact with adjacent aircraft while simultaneously watching for fighters, monitoring instruments, and dealing with the physical stress of flying at altitude in unpressurized, unheated aircraft where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. After 3 or 4 hours of this, and missions to targets in Germany could last 8 to 10 hours, pilot exhaustion led to formation discipline breaking down. Aircraft would drift farther apart. Some bombers would lag behind. The formation would stretch out over several miles, creating even more vulnerable gaps for German fighters to exploit. The loss rates were unsustainable, and everyone from crew chiefs to theater commanders knew it. After Schweinfurt, 8th Air Force Commander, General Ira Eaker faced a grim calculus. At current attrition rates, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse before the end of 1943. Curtis LeMay didn't look like someone who was about to revolutionize aerial warfare. The 36-year-old colonel was blunt, taciturn, and had a permanent scowl that made subordinates nervous. He'd been flying combat missions over Europe since May of 1942 with the 305th Bomb Group, and he'd watched too many bombers go down because of poor formation discipline. While other commanders accepted the losses as inevitable costs of war, LeMay saw them as a solvable engineering problem. He started asking a dangerous question. What if everything we've been taught about bomber formations is wrong? LeMay's insight came from pure geometry. If you stacked bombers in 3 dimensions instead of spreading them in 2, you could create overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach angle. The key was thinking of the formation not as a line of aircraft, but as a defensive box, a flying fortress made of fortresses. In late 1942, while stationed at Grafton Underwood with the 305th Bomb Group, LeMay began sketching formations on paper, calculating gun angles and coverage zones. He measured the effective range of every defensive position on a B-17, the tail guns, waist guns, ball turret, top turret, and nose guns. Then he positioned aircraft in space so their guns overlapped. The combat box, officially called the Defensive Combat Box Formation, arranged bombers in a tight three-dimensional wedge approximately 600 yards wide, 900 yards long, and 750 feet tall. Instead of one horizontal line of aircraft, LeMay created 3 staggered squadrons. The lead squadron of 6 or 7 bombers flew at the base altitude, typically around 25,000 feet. The high squadron positioned itself 1,000 feet above and slightly behind the lead, offset to the right. The low squadron flew 1,000 feet below and slightly behind the lead, offset to the left. When you looked at this formation from the front, it resembled a diamond or box shape. Each squadron maintained tight spacing with aircraft flying as close as 50 feet apart, wingtip to wingtip. That proximity terrified pilots initially. One small mistake at that distance could cause a mid-air collision that would destroy multiple bombers instantly. But LeMay was adamant. Tight spacing was non-negotiable. The closer the bombers flew, the more their defensive guns overlapped, creating zones where attacking fighters would face fire from 5 or 6 different aircraft simultaneously. LeMay calculated that a German pilot attacking the formation from any angle would be exposed to concentrated fire from at least 18 to 24 machine guns. No fighter could survive that gauntlet. The mathematical advantage was staggering. In the old loose formations, a fighter attacking from the 6 o'clock position, directly behind the formation, might face fire from just the tail gunner of the targeted bomber and maybe one waist gunner from a nearby aircraft. That's 3 or 4 guns at most. In the combat box, that same attack vector would expose the fighter to tail guns from the lead squadron, top turret fire from the low squadron, and ball turret fire from the high squadron. 9 or 10 guns firing simultaneously into the same space. The fighter would have to fly through a cone of intersecting tracer fire, and the probability of taking hits increased exponentially. LeMay tested the formation on a mission to Lille, France on October 9, 1942. He led 18 B-17s in a tight combat box against a heavily defended target. German fighters attacked repeatedly, making more than 50 passes at the formation. Not a single bomber was shot down. Compare that to another group flying the same mission in a loose formation. They lost 3 aircraft out of 12. The difference was undeniable. LeMay's formation returned with battle damage. Sure, every aircraft had holes, but all 18 bombers made it home. Crews reported that German fighters seemed hesitant to press attacks when they saw the density of return fire. Word spread quickly through the 8th Air Force. Other bomb group commanders flew to Grafton Underwood to watch LeMay's briefings and study the formation diagrams. Some were skeptical. The tight spacing still made experienced pilots nervous, but the loss rate spoke louder than tradition. By January of 1943, General Eaker ordered all bomb groups to begin training in the combat box formation. LeMay was promoted to Brigadier General and given command of the 3rd Bomb Division, where he could implement his tactics across dozens of bomb groups. The combat box wasn't just a new formation pattern, it represented a fundamental shift in thinking about bomber defense. Instead of relying on individual aircraft survivability, LeMay created a system where the formation itself became the defensive weapon. The whole was dramatically greater than the sum of its parts. Flying in the combat box required precision that most civilian pilots would consider impossible. The lead squadron set the entire formation's altitude, speed, and heading. Every other aircraft adjusted constantly to maintain exact positioning relative to the lead bomber. Pilots called it formation flying on instruments and willpower, half science, half endurance test. The lead bomber was flown by the most experienced pilot in the group, often the group commander himself, because every slight change in throttle or altitude rippled through the entire box. If the lead pilot climbed 50 feet, 18 other aircraft had to match that climb while maintaining their relative positions to each other. The high squadron flew 1,000 feet above the lead and approximately 150 yards back, staggered to the right side. This wasn't arbitrary. The 1,000-foot altitude difference meant the high squadron's ball turret gunners, positioned on the belly of the aircraft, could fire downward at fighters attacking the lead squadron without hitting friendly bombers. Simultaneously, The top turret gunners in the lead squadron could fire upward to protect the high squadron. The 150-yard setback created a diagonal relationship that maximized gun coverage overlap while preventing collisions during evasive maneuvers. The low squadron mirrored this geometry on the left side, 1,000 feet below lead, staggered back and offset. Low squadron pilots had the hardest job psychologically. They flew beneath everyone else, watching bomb bay doors open above them, knowing that if anyone accidentally released ordnance early, it would fall straight through their formation. On missions to heavily defended targets, the low squadron also caught more flak. German anti-aircraft gunners typically aimed for the middle of the formation and adjusted fire based on burst patterns. The low squadron flew directly into the zone where ranging shots exploded. Within each squadron, aircraft maintained brutal proximity. Wingtip to wingtip spacing shrank to 50 feet or less, close enough to see the expression on the pilot's face in the next bomber. Vertical spacing between aircraft in the same squadron was typically 30 feet. At 150 miles per hour indicated airspeed, the standard cruise speed for formation flying that left almost no margin for error. Pilots had to anticipate turbulence and prop wash from nearby aircraft. The bombers were heavy, each weighing 65,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel and bombs, which meant they didn't respond quickly to control inputs. You couldn't yank a B-17 out of someone's way. Formation flying was constant minor corrections. A little throttle, slight back pressure on the yoke, a touch of rudder trim, repeated hundreds of times per hour. Prop wash created the most dangerous turbulence. Each B-17's 4 engines generated massive vortices of swirling air behind the bomber. Aircraft flying directly behind another bomber got hammered by this turbulence constantly. Pilots described it as riding a violent roller coaster for hours. The aircraft would suddenly drop 30 feet, then get kicked sideways, then climb rapidly as invisible walls of churning air slammed into the wings and fuselage. Crews in the back of the aircraft, waist gunners, radio operators, ball turret gunners, got airsick frequently. They'd be fighting nausea while simultaneously watching for enemy fighters and trying to operate their guns in -40-degree cold. The physical strain accumulated relentlessly. Missions lasted 8 to 10 hours. Pilots spent that entire time gripping the control yoke, making constant corrections, breathing through oxygen masks that froze moisture from their breath into ice crystals that could block airflow. They wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned, leading to frostbite on fingers and toes. By the time formations crossed back over the English Channel and began descent into home bases, some pilots were so exhausted they could barely land. Co-pilots often took control for the landing approach, while aircraft commanders sat slumped in their seats, shaking from fatigue and adrenaline depletion. The defensive mathematics of the combat box were brutally simple. Force multiplication through geometry. A lone B-17 carried 13 machine guns, but many of those weapons couldn't engage a fighter attacking from certain angles simultaneously. The tail gunner handled 6 o'clock attacks. The ball turret covered the belly. The top turret protected the dorsal area. Waist gunners covered beam attacks from the sides, but these were individual gunners reacting to individual threats. A German pilot, attacking from 10 o'clock high, from the left front at an elevated angle, might face fire from only the top turret and left waist gunner. That's 2 guns, maybe 3 if the nose gunner could swing his weapon around quickly enough. Now put 18 B-17s in a combat box, and that same attack vector becomes a death sentence for the fighter pilot. The German comes in from 10 o'clock high, and he's not just attacking one bomber. He's entering a 3-dimensional kill zone created by multiple aircraft stacked vertically and staggered horizontally. The top turret gunners from the low squadron have a perfect shot at him because he's above and in front of their aircraft. The ball turret gunners from the high squadron can engage him because he's below their position. The waist gunners from the lead squadron have him in their beam coverage. Suddenly, instead of facing 2 or 3 guns, that fighter is flying into converging fire from 9 or 10 machine guns, all firing 50 caliber rounds at 800 rounds per minute per gun. The math gets even more lethal when you calculate cone of fire. Each 50 caliber machine gun on a B-17 had a traverse range, the arc through which it could aim. The top turret could rotate 360 degrees and elevate from level up to 90 degrees straight up. That created a dome of potential coverage above the aircraft. The ball turret could rotate 360 degrees and depress downward, creating a dome below. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When you positioned multiple bombers in 3 dimensions, these individual coverage domes intersected and overlapped. The result was zones of space where a fighter pilot would be targeted by multiple guns from multiple bombers simultaneously. Curtis LeMay had calculated these zones precisely. He determined that the most vulnerable approach for fighters was head-on, straight into the nose of the formation, because early B-17F models had limited forward-firing armament. Just 2 handheld 50 caliber guns operated, by the bombardier and navigator in the nose. But even that vulnerability was mitigated in the combat box because the high and low squadrons flew offset. A fighter making a head-on pass at the lead squadron would expose his beam, his side profile, to the high and low squadron's gunners. Those waist gunners and turret gunners had perfect 90-degree deflection shots. The fighter would be flying perpendicular to their guns at close range. The easiest shot in air combat, the density of fire created psychological pressure that mattered as much as actual hit probability. Luftwaffe pilots reported that attacking the tight American boxes felt like flying into a wall of tracers. Every 5th round in a 50 caliber belt was a tracer, a round with a small incendiary charge that left a visible streak of light. When 18 bombers put up defensive fire simultaneously, the sky filled with glowing streaks. Pilots saw dozens of tracer streams converging on their position. Even if most rounds missed, the visual effect was overwhelming. It took exceptional courage to continue pressing an attack when you could see that much lead filling the air around your cockpit. The actual hit probability increased exponentially with multiple gunners engaging the same target. A single gunner firing at a fighter, maneuvering at 350 miles per hour, had maybe a 5% chance of scoring effective hits in a typical engagement. But when 5 or 6 gunners fired at the same fighter simultaneously, the probability space changed. The fighter pilot now had to maneuver to avoid multiple streams of fire coming from different angles. Dodging fire from one gun often meant flying into the trajectory of another. The combined volume of fire created a statistical inevitability. Given enough time in the kill zone, the fighter would be hit. German loss reports from late 1943 confirmed the effectiveness. After the Americans fully adopted the combat box, Luftwaffe fighter losses spiked dramatically. In missions where German fighters engaged tight box formations, their loss rates ran between 15 and 20% per sortie, unsustainable by any military standard. Experienced fighter pilots started avoiding the boxes when possible, looking for stragglers or damaged bombers that had fallen out of formation. Those isolated aircraft became the priority targets because engaging the main formation meant accepting heavy casualties. The Americans refined the system further by creating larger formations composed of multiple combat boxes. Instead of one 18-aircraft box, they'd fly 3 or 4 boxes in trail, stacked vertically and staggered horizontally. This created a bomber stream that could stretch for 50 miles. Each box maintained its internal defensive integrity, while also providing supporting fire for adjacent boxes. A fighter attempting to dive through one box to attack from below would climb back up directly into the defensive fire from the box above it. The layered formations turned the entire bomber stream into a continuous zone of overlapping firepower that extended vertically from 23,000 feet to 27,000 feet and horizontally for miles. The proof arrived in blood and aluminum over Germany in the summer and fall of 1943. The mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg on August 17th became the dividing line between the old way of doing things and the new doctrine. The 8th Air Force planned a double strike that day. 146 B-17s would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continue south to bases in North Africa. 230 more B-17s would attack ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and return to England. Both targets sat deep in Germany, beyond the range of escort fighters. The bombers would be on their own for hours. The formations that day represented a transition period. Some groups flew tight combat boxes. Others still used looser formations. The 4th Bomb Wing, heading to Regensburg, led by Curtis LeMay himself, flew disciplined combat boxes with aircraft stacked tightly in 3 dimensions. The groups attacking Schweinfurt showed more variation in formation discipline. Weather delays meant the 2 forces didn't launch simultaneously as planned, giving German fighter controllers time to recover and rearm between attacks. The Luftwaffe threw everything available at both formations. Nearly 300 fighters hit the bomber streams over Germany. The Regensburg force flying LeMay's tight boxes lost 24 bombers out of 146, a 16% loss rate. Brutal, certainly, but consider what those bombers accomplished. They destroyed or heavily damaged nearly all the Messerschmitt assembly facilities, setting German fighter production back by months. More importantly, the loss rate was significantly lower than what 8th Air Force had experienced in earlier deep penetration missions. LeMay's lead group, the 305th, lost just 1 aircraft out of 18. Groups flying looser variations of the formation lost 3 or 4 bombers each. The pattern was unmistakable. Tighter formations survived better. The Schweinfurt force took heavier losses. 36 bombers shot down out of 230, roughly 15%. But here again, the variation between groups was revealing. The 381 bomb group flying a tight defensive box lost 2 aircraft. The 91st Bomb Group, which had struggled with formation discipline throughout the flight due to cloud banks over the North Sea, lost 10 bombers, nearly a third of their force. Post-mission debrief showed that German fighters focused on groups with ragged formations where gaps between aircraft gave them approach angles with reduced defensive fire. The mission report submitted to 8th Air Force headquarters 3 days later included detailed analysis of loss, patterns correlated with formation discipline. Groups that maintained tight combat boxes throughout the mission experienced loss rates between 10 and 14%. Groups where formation integrity broke down due to weather, crew fatigue, or aircraft mechanical problems suffered losses between 25 and 30%. The report's conclusion was unequivocal. Formation discipline was now the primary determinant of bomber survival, more important than aircraft durability, gunner skill, or even target defenses. General Eaker ordered mandatory combat box training for all bomb groups. By October of 1943, the entire 8th Air Force had standardized on the formation. The results showed up immediately in the loss statistics. In August 1943, the average loss rate per mission was 6.2%. By December 1943, after full combat box implementation, the average dropped to 3.8%. That might sound like a modest improvement, just 2.4 percentage points, but over the course of hundreds of missions involving thousands of aircraft, it meant thousands of airmen who came home instead of dying over Germany. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943 provided another data point, though a grimmer one. The 8th Air Force sent 2 91 B-17s back to finish destroying the ball-bearing plants. The Luftwaffe, now fully aware of how dangerous these deep penetration raids were to German industry, committed over 350 fighters. The Americans lost 60 bombers, a devastating 20% loss rate. But even in this disaster, formation discipline made the difference between survival and annihilation. The lead groups, which maintained tight boxes despite relentless fighter attacks, lost between 12 and 15% of their aircraft. Trailing groups, where formation discipline deteriorated after watching the lead units get hammered, lost up to 30%. 60 bombers gone meant 600 men killed, captured, or missing. The losses were so severe that Eaker temporarily suspended deep penetration missions until long-range escort fighters became available. But the mission proved the combat box concept even in defeat. German fighter pilots reported to their commanders that breaking through the American boxes required multiple coordinated attacks from different angles, and even then the casualties among Luftwaffe fighters were running at 15 to 20 aircraft lost per mission. The exchange rate had shifted. The Americans were losing bombers, yes, but they were producing B-17s faster than Boeing could deliver them. 16 aircraft per day by late 1943. The Germans couldn't replace experienced fighter pilots at anywhere near that rate. The October 14th mission was also the last time the 8th Air Force would fly deep into Germany without fighter escort. By December 1943, P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The combination of long-range escorts and tight defensive formations dropped bomber loss rates below 3% by spring 1944. The air war over Germany had fundamentally changed, and the combat box was a central reason why American bombers could survive long enough to destroy German industry. The effectiveness of the combat box is demonstrated by comprehensive survival statistics. Of the 12,731 B-17s built during the entire war, 4,735 were lost in combat operations, representing a loss rate of 37%. But detailed analysis shows clearly that bombers maintaining formation discipline in combat boxes had survival rates significantly higher than the overall average, while those that became separated had survival rates far below average. A bomber that fell out of formation had perhaps a 20% chance of reaching friendly territory. Most were shot down within minutes. Conversely, a bomber that maintained its position had better than 50% chance of survival, even on heavily opposed missions. The difference between life and death was often nothing more than holding position in the combat box. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, radio operator flying with the 305 bomb group, wrote in a letter home that was later donated to the National Air Force Museum, "The formation is everything. You see a bomber fall out and you know he's done for. The fighters swarm him like sharks around blood in the water. But if you stay in the box, if you hold your position no matter what, the other bombers protect you with their guns, and you protect them with yours. That's the only way any of us survive." The costs were horrific and must be acknowledged honestly. The 8th Air Force suffered 54,000 casualties during the combined bomber offensive, with 26,000 killed in action and 28,000 taken prisoner. To put this in perspective, 8th Air Force casualties exceeded the entire Marine Corps casualties in the Pacific Theater. The peak losses came during the second half of 1943, when deep penetration missions without adequate fighter escort led to unsustainable loss rates. The courage required to climb into a bomber, knowing the odds were against survival, cannot be overstated. The statistical reality of the combat box remained stark and undeniable. A 54-plane combat wing of B-17Gs fielded over 700 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet. These guns were arranged in three-dimensional space to create overlapping fields of fire covering every possible approach angle. Any fighter attempting to attack the formation had to fly through this wall of defensive fire, and for several seconds. Luftwaffe analysis confirmed that German pilots found attacking intact formations extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The defensive fire forced early breakaways, made accurate gunnery nearly impossible, and occasionally shot them down. The development of the combat box also represented a uniquely American approach to warfare that combined engineering, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation. Where other nations might have abandoned daylight bombing after discovering its costs, the Americans engineered a solution. They analyzed the problem systematically, studied loss patterns, experimented with different formations, and refined tactics based on combat results. The solution required massive industrial capacity to build thousands of heavy bombers, each carrying 13 heavy machine guns. Building 12,000 B-17s required millions of man-hours and coordination across dozens of states. The combat box was not just a tactical formation, but a manifestation of American organizational capability and industrial power. It represented using technological superiority and organizational skill to overcome tactical challenges. When Curtis LeMay first tested the formation over Lille on December 6, 1942, he was experimenting with a theoretical solution to a tactical problem. He had analyzed the defensive weaknesses of loose formations, calculated fields of fire for various gun positions, and designed a formation that maximized overlapping coverage. By the time the war ended in May of 1945, less than 3 years later, the combat box had become the standard by which all bomber formations were judged. Over 12,000 B-17s flew combat missions, using variations of the combat box formation. They dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on German targets, destroying factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and military installations. They forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it could not win, and they demonstrated conclusively that with proper tactics, adequate armament, and extraordinary crew skill, daylight strategic bombing could succeed even against the most determined opposition. The men who flew in those formations understood exactly what they were doing and accepted the risks knowingly. They knew the statistics. Intelligence officers briefed them on loss rates before missions. They could count empty beds in their barracks. They knew that completing a 25-mission tour required not just skill and courage, but enormous luck. The pre-mission rituals reflected this knowledge. Some men wrote letters to be mailed home if they didn't return. Others prayed. Some carried lucky charms. They put on their gear methodically, checked their equipment carefully, and walked to their aircraft with the quiet determination of men doing a job that had to be done regardless of cost. The combat box formations represent what ordinary Americans can accomplish when called upon to do extraordinary things. In the arithmetic of aerial warfare, the formation gave crews a fighting chance. It doesn't sound like much, but when you multiply those odds across 350,000 bomber crewmen who flew combat missions over Europe, the combat box saved tens of thousands of lives. The geometric solution to a geometric problem, executed by ordinary men doing extraordinary things at 25,000 feet over hostile territory. That's how formations won the air war over Europe. One tightly held position at a time. The Luftwaffe wasn't about to accept massive casualties without adapting. German fighter pilots were among the best trained in the world in 1943, and they'd been fighting since 1939. 4 years of combat experience taught brutal lessons in survival and effectiveness. When the Americans started flying tight combat boxes, German squadrons needed new tactics immediately. The old approaches, leisurely beam attacks from 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock, tail chases from 6 o'clock, became suicide missions against formations throwing up walls of coordinated defensive fire. The head-on attack became the Luftwaffe's primary answer to the combat box. Instead of attacking from the sides or rear, where American gunners had excellent fields of fire and plenty of time to track incoming fighters, German pilots began positioning themselves 5 to 7 miles ahead of the bomber formation, climbing to gain 2,000 or 3,000 feet of altitude advantage, then rolling over into steep dives aimed directly at the lead bomber's nose. The closing speed in a head-on pass reached 550 to 600 miles per hour, the fighter's forward speed plus the bomber speed combined. That gave both sides maybe 3 seconds of firing opportunity. Those 3 seconds were absolutely terrifying for bomber crews. The early B-17F models that flew most of the 1943 missions had minimal nose armament. Just 2 handheld 50-caliber guns operated by the bombardier and navigator, who were trying to aim flexible weapons while bracing against their mounts as the aircraft shook from turbulence and defensive maneuvers. Meanwhile, a Messerschmitt 109 diving head-on carried a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. The Focke-Wulf 190 was even more heavily armed. 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. The German pilot had a stable gun platform, a computing gun sight, and 6 weapons firing simultaneously. The kill probability favored the attacker heavily. The head-on pass also minimized the fighter's exposure time in the bomber formation's defensive envelope. The German would fire a 2 or 3 second burst, starting at about 1,000 yards, outside the effective range of the bombers. Nose guns, and keep firing until he reached 200 yards, then brake violently down or to the side to avoid collision. Total time exposed to return fire, maybe 4 seconds. Then he'd dive below the formation, pull up several miles away, and set up for another pass. Luftwaffe doctrine called for multiple fighters to attack in trail, a string of 4 or 5 aircraft coming in nose-on with 5 or 10 second intervals between them. The bomber crews would barely finish tracking one fighter before the next one appeared in their windscreen. American losses to head-on attacks spiked in fall 1943. Combat reports from returning crews consistently mentioned fighters attacking from 12 o'clock high or 12 o'clock level. Boeing responded by modifying the B-17 design. The B-17G model, which entered service in September 1943, added a chin turret below the nose. Two 50 caliber guns in a powered turret operated by the bombardier. This gave the bomber legitimate forward-firing defensive capability. The difference was noticeable within weeks. German pilots reported that head-on attacks against the G models resulted in higher fighter losses because the bombers could put up effective defensive fire earlier in the engagement. So, the Luftwaffe adapted again. They started experimenting with standoff weapons, rockets and cannons that could engage bombers from beyond the range of defensive machine guns. The Werfer-Granate 21, called the Nebelwerfer rocket by Allied crews, was a 210mm unguided rocket carried under the wings of Messerschmitt 1-10 and Messerschmitt 4-10 twin-engine fighters. These fighters would position themselves 1,200 to 1,500 yards away from the bomber formation, safely outside machine gun range, and salvo their rockets into the formation. The rockets weren't accurate enough to reliably hit individual bombers, but they didn't need to be. The 21-centimeter warhead carried 40 kilograms of high explosive. A near miss within 20 or 30 feet would shred a bomber with shrapnel. The psychological impact of rocket attacks was significant. Bomber crews watched these massive projectiles streak toward them, trailing smoke, knowing they had no way to evade or shoot back. The rockets moved too fast to dodge. If one was coming at you, you just waited to see if it would hit or miss. Some rockets tumbled in flight due to poor quality control in German munitions factories, making them even more unpredictable. The Americans tried various countermeasures, having formations make coordinated turns when they saw rocket launches, spreading out slightly to give the unguided rockets less chance of hitting anything, but these adjustments weakened the defensive box and made the formations more vulnerable to conventional fighter attacks. The Luftwaffe also deployed heavier cannons. The Mk-108 30mm cannon installed in some Messerschmitt 109s and most Me-262 jets, later in the war fired a high-explosive shell that could destroy a B-17 with just 3 or 4 hits. One 30mm shell hitting an engine or fuel tank could doom a bomber, but the Mk-108 had a low muzzle velocity, which meant German pilots had to get close, within 400 yards, to hit reliably. That put them back inside the defensive fire envelope, where the combat box's overlapping guns could engage them. It became a deadly calculus: get close enough to use the heavy cannon effectively, or stay at range and accept lower hit probability. Despite these tactical innovations, the Luftwaffe never solved the fundamental problem of the combat box. Every adaptation the Germans made involved trade-offs that reduced effectiveness in other areas. Head-on attacks were high risk for fighter pilots. Standoff weapons required specialized aircraft and reduced the number of conventional fighters available. Heavy cannons meant getting close to murderous defensive fire. By early 1944, when long-range P-51 escorts began accompanying bombers throughout their missions, the Luftwaffe's tactical adaptations became irrelevant. German fighters now had to fight through American escorts before they could even reach the bomber boxes. And that two-front battle, American fighters above and behind, bomber defensive fire ahead, became unsustainable. The combat box had forced the Luftwaffe into tactical corners it couldn't escape, buying time for the escorts to arrive and turn the air war decisively in favor of the Allies. The numbers tell the story with merciless clarity. Before widespread adoption of the combat box formation in mid-1943, 8th Air Force bomber loss rates averaged between 5.5 and 6.5% per mission. That percentage might seem small until you calculate what it meant for individual crews. A bomber crew's tour of duty was 25 missions. At a 6% loss rate per mission, the probability of completing a full tour was roughly 22%. Flip that around. 78% of crews would be shot down, killed, or captured before finishing 25 missions. Those weren't acceptable odds by any military standard, but they were the reality American bomber crews faced in early 1943. After combat box implementation became standard across all bomb groups by November 1943, loss rates dropped to between 1.8 and 2.2% per mission on average. Some missions still saw catastrophic losses. The second Schweinfurt raid, the Ploesti oil refineries raid, but the baseline attrition rate had fallen by more than 70%. That 1.8 to 2.2% loss rate translated to a 64% probability of surviving a full tour. Still not great odds. You were essentially flipping a weighted coin, but dramatically better than the near-certain death sentence crews faced earlier. Thousands of airmen came home because their formations held together under fire. The 70% reduction wasn't purely about formation geometry. Multiple factors contributed to improved survival rates between 1943 and 1945. The introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts in December 1943 reduced bomber losses substantially. When fighters could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, Luftwaffe fighters couldn't focus solely on breaking up bomber formations without dealing with escorts first. Improved armor plating on B-17G and B-24J models meant bombers could absorb more punishment and still make it home. Better crew training programs meant gunners could shoot more accurately and pilots could fly formation more precisely. But formation discipline remained the foundation everything else built upon. The combat box created the defensive umbrella that kept bombers alive long enough for escorts to arrive, or for the formation to fight through to the target and back. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined thousands of mission reports and loss records. The data showed a consistent pattern. Groups that maintained tight formation discipline throughout missions had loss rates 60 to 75% lower than groups where formation integrity broke down. This held true even when comparing missions to the same targets on the same days. Formation discipline was the variable that predicted survival. The strategic impact extended beyond individual crew survival rates. The combat box made sustained strategic bombing campaigns possible. Before tight formations, the losses were so severe that 8th Air Force couldn't generate enough sorties to systematically destroy German industrial capacity. They'd hit a target, lose 20 or 30% of the attacking force, then need weeks to replace aircraft and train new crews before mounting another major raid. The Germans would repair the damage in the meantime. The bombing campaign was a stalemate, destruction and reconstruction running at roughly equal rates. The combat box changed that calculus. With loss rates below 3%, the Americans could mount large-scale raids every few days rather than every few weeks. The frequency of attacks meant German industry couldn't recover between raids. Ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt got hit in August, again in October, and then repeatedly throughout early 1944. Aircraft factories at Regensburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Marienburg received sustained attention. By mid-1944, German fighter production had fallen by 40% despite frantic efforts to disperse factories and increase output. The Luftwaffe was losing the attrition battle, losing more fighters and pilots than they could replace, and the combat box was a significant reason why American bomber losses stayed low enough to maintain the pressure. The formation concept influenced bomber doctrine for decades. After the war, when the United States Air Force transitioned to jet-powered strategic bombers like the B-47 and B-52, formation flying remained central to operational planning through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. The advent of surface-to-air missiles and supersonic interceptors eventually made tight formations obsolete. Modern bombers operate individually, relying on electronic countermeasures and stealth rather than mutual defensive fire. But the principle LeMay established remained relevant for 20 years. Aircraft operating together according to disciplined tactical doctrine survived better than aircraft operating independently. Curtis LeMay received much of the credit, and deservedly so. He saw the problem clearly when others accepted losses as inevitable, and he engineered a solution based on mathematics and geometry rather than tradition. He was promoted to Major General by August 1944 and eventually commanded Strategic Air Command during the Cold War, where his emphasis on discipline and tactical precision shaped American nuclear deterrence strategy. But the real credit belongs to the tens of thousands of pilots who flew wingtip to wingtip at 50-foot spacing for 8 hours at a time. Who held formation while flak tore through their aircraft? Who stayed in position while watching bombers next to them explode? The combat box worked because air crews executed it with extraordinary skill under unimaginable stress. The B-17 crews who pioneered the combat box over Germany in 1943 didn't have the luxury of knowing how the war would end. They climbed into their aircraft each morning knowing the statistical odds weren't in their favor. They flew anyway. The formations they flew, those tight, disciplined, three-dimensional boxes that turned individual bombers into aerial fortresses, gave them a fighting chance. In the arithmetic of aerial warfare, that chance was the difference between a mission with a 1 in 4 chance of death and a mission with a 1 in 3 chance of survival. It doesn't sound like much, but when you multiply those odds across 350,000 bomber crewmen who flew combat missions over Europe, the combat box saved tens of thousands of lives. The geometric solution to a geometric problem, executed by ordinary men doing extraordinary things at 25,000 feet over hostile territory. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, ball turret gunner with the 305 bomb group, flew 27 missions successfully before Black Thursday. The night before the second Schweinfurt raid, Graham wrote a letter home that his family preserved. "We all know what we're facing tomorrow. Schweinfurt is the toughest target in Germany, but the formation will protect us as much as anything can. If we stay together, if we hold the box no matter what happens, some of us will make it through. The formation gives us that chance." Graham's aircraft was shot down over Schweinfurt the next day. His bomber took several direct hits, caught fire, and went into a spin. Only 3 parachutes were seen leaving the aircraft. Graham was not among the survivors. He was 22 years old, but his words capture the essence of what the combat box meant to the men who flew it. Not a guarantee of survival, not invincibility, just a chance. A fighting chance built on mutual protection and iron discipline. Every man doing his job so that all of them might make it home. The historical significance of the combat box lies not just in its tactical effectiveness, but in what it represented about American air power doctrine. The Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing over heavily defended targets, a strategy that seemed suicidal when the Royal Air Force had already abandoned daylight bombing due to prohibitive losses. The Americans refused to abandon the concept. They believed destroying specific industrial targets was essential to winning the war, and that only daylight bombing could provide the necessary accuracy. The combat box was the solution that made daylight precision bombing viable by concentrating defensive firepower to levels that German fighters could not easily overwhelm. The formations required extraordinary crew skill, physical stamina, and courage. Flying in tight combat box formation for 8 to 10 hours at altitude in sub-zero temperatures, while being attacked by fighters and surrounded by flak bursts, tested men to their absolute limits. Yet thousands of crews did this repeatedly, completing 25 or more missions. Many continued flying even after completing their required tours. The sense of mission, the belief that they were helping win the war and save lives by shortening the conflict, sustained them through experiences that would have broken lesser men. In the history of aerial warfare, few tactical innovations have had greater impact or required greater courage from the men who executed them. The combat box stands as testament to both American ingenuity and the extraordinary bravery of young men who flew tight formation through walls of fire above Hitler's Europe. These men, average age 23, many fresh from farms and small towns across America, climbed into their bombers day after day and faced odds that would have broken professional soldiers. They did this because they believed in their mission, that they were fighting to end tyranny, to defend freedom, to protect their families. This belief sustained them through experiences that left psychological scars many carried for the rest of their lives. The combat box formations represent what ordinary Americans can accomplish when called upon to do extraordinary things, and they remain one of the most remarkable tactical innovations in modern military history, accomplished not through force alone, but through the combination of American industrial might, organizational genius, and the raw courage of young men who refused to accept defeat. That's how formations won the air war over Europe, one tightly held position at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.